Ready? Okay. Yeah, I'm good. Okay. Yeah, you're good. Oh, I just did something. Oh no. Oh, hold on. Oh, thank you for your patience as we figure out our technical difficulties. Technology is wonderful and awful all at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself while we figure out our technologies. That way I don't want to eat into too much of Colin's great lecture. My name is Robin Axel Adams. I'm the manager of the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. We are so excited that you are here. This is our annual Meg Gaffney lecture in medical humanities. When Dr. Gaffney retired a few years ago, we wanted to honor her and continue to honor her and what the work that she did in the area of clinical ethics around Indianapolis. And so she had a passion for the humanities. And so we have named an annual lecture series after her. So we're so excited to be able to present that annual lecture in her honor today. In a little bit, there will be a code on the screen, which you will be able to get your CE or CME credit for today. We'll make sure that gets up there. And certificates are being sent out about 30 days after the lecture. So you can expect those in about a month. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, fairbankscenter.org, within the next week. We encourage you to send your colleagues the information, and they will also be able to get for a limited time CE and CME credit. The Q&A box, for those of you who are joining us virtually, is available to pose questions throughout. However, we will not be responding to most of those questions until the end of the presentation. And Dr. Halverson has no relevant financial conflicts of interest to disclose. All right, so now in order to introduce our sponsor, or our sponsor, oh boy, Colin, thank you so much for sponsoring the lecture today. No, our speaker. Dr. Colin Halverson is assistant professor of medicine at the IU School of Medicine and faculty investigator in the Center of Bioethics. He also is affiliate faculty here with the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago in medicine and linguistics anthropology and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in bioethics at Vanderbilt University. His research focuses on ethical issues related to rare diseases, genetic testing, and the return of results, in particular with regards to Ehlers-Danlos. I said there were no hard words, Colin, and then Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And if I did not pronounce that correctly, he can correct me when I'm in a minute. Today, however, he will talk about historical biographical work that he has been conducting with Professor Jane Hartsock, our very own. And outside of work, Colin enjoys painting, baking, and caring for his numerous plants. So, Colin, I hope that we can hear what your favorite thing to bake is and what plant is your favorite plant, if you're allowed to have favorite plants. All right, so thank you so much for presenting today, Colin. I may pull you back up here, Annie, because right now Teams is coming back up over the. All right, let me pull this. Oh, that's the one I'm supposed to. There we go. I think I got it now. Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hi, folks who may or may not be online. That was a great introduction, so I will skip over the intro portion of this. I do want to flag, though, that this is work that I've been doing in collaboration with Professor Hartsock, whom all of you know. She can't be here today, but she's been an active participant in the production of all of the research that I'm going to talk about and also this specific talk. So thanks goes out to her as well. As was mentioned, I have no relevant conflicts of interest. And since this is a medical humanities talk, I didn't realize, in honor of Meg Gaffney, hello, Meg, if you're out there, I thought it was appropriate to begin with a quote. This, I think, is a very poignant quote. Anytime I have a quote up here, I'm not going to read it. I don't like reading off of PowerPoint slides, so please take a moment to peruse at your own leisure, but I will always provide context for the quotes. This, when I first came across it, felt very relevant both to today's talk, but also struck me as really salient for my own work, which was mentioned, largely revolves around the care of patients with rare pain disorders. So I think the primary thing that's of interest to me with this quote is the way that it connects the ethical issues, both of the biographical project that I'll be talking about in a moment, but also to help us think about how we represent our patient stories and the responses of our research participants as well. Brief outline for today's talk. I'm going to begin by presenting kind of an introduction to some of the ethical issues of how we represent our subjects, both in biographical work, this kind of historical work, and in more traditional research for someone in a medical school. And that's mainly meant to be kind of an entree into what will be the rest of the talk, which really focuses on the actual biography of our main character, whose name is Dr. Karl von Klein, who was an immigrant and a surgeon and a translator around the time of the turn of the 20th century. And so I'll talk quite a bit about his and his children's lives as a way of thinking through some of these issues of representation. And then here you can see three cases that I'll use as kind of a deep dive, none of which you have to understand yet, but all of which you will in the future, I promise. And then I'll finally close with an afterword in which I'll kind of synthesize a lot of these issues and tie them back to how we think about talking about patients and research participants. So all this ethics of representation kind of focuses on what's called life writing, which is an overarching term used to capture a range of intellectual activities, including, importantly for me, both biography and ethnography, the role of an anthropologist, but also professional practices such as journalism, playwriting, memoir, and I would throw in the writing of case reports and patient histories. And I'll also say this is the first time I'm presenting any of this work in public. It's also the first time that Professor Hartzog and I have put pen to paper on any of these specific thoughts that we've been talking about for several years at this point. So you'll have to forgive me when I read from the script. Yeah, so anyway, we have three specific duties or interests with moral weight that we have to consider when participating in life writing. These are our duties to ourselves as the author, to our audiences as readers, and to our subjects as ends in themselves, meaning not merely as means to an end, but humans worthy of dignity in their own right. Each of these relationships entails its own distinctive set of duties and obligations, and they are often in tension, as are all good ethical relationships. When I first came to Indiana University about 5 years ago, Professor Hartzog was teaching a survey course of medical humanities and was looking for early examples of researchers recognizing the contributions of pre-Greek and non-Western thought to empirical biomedicine. To that end, she discussed an ancient Egyptian medical text called the Ebers Papyrus with her class. The papyrus appears to have been composed over 3.5 millennia ago, and possibly includes extracts from yet older sources, making it likely the oldest surviving medical papyrus known to this day. Moreover, it is the longest, the most complete, and best preserved. The papyrus came to Western attention after being looted from the necropolis of Thebes in approximately 1858, reportedly tucked in a wooden statuette of Osiris that had been laid between the legs of a mummy. The first translation into German appeared in 1890 and was immediately of great interest to the emerging field of the history of medicine, because while it still contained magical spells and spoke of demons, it simultaneously promoted empirically grounded therapies, as well as some medical recipes that are still in use today. Many of the first scholars examined the papyrus, the papyrus, exclaimed that it overthrew Hippocrates as the father of medicine and demonstrated that Western science had much deeper, much less Western roots. Professor Hartzog had stumbled across a speech given by a surgeon translator to the American Medical Association in 1905, in which he described his attempts to become the first person to translate the Ebers Papyrus into English. His name was Dr. Carl von Klein. Intrigued by his early and radical insights into the true origins of empirical medicine, she quoted his speech at length to her class. However, Professor Hartzog could find nothing about his biography to contextualize the speech for her students. Who was he? Where did he come from? How did he manage his research? And most important, where was his translation? She approached me about collaborating on a short stint of investigation into this enigmatic man in hopes that she might be able to teach directly from his manuscript in the future. Thus, in August 2019, just a few months before the world shut down due to the COVID pandemic, we sat down in Professor Hartzog's office, Microsoft Word at the ready, as she dialed the number of von Klein's great-granddaughter, whom she connected with over Facebook. And on another occasion, we spoke with that woman's cousin on a different branch of the von Klein tree. Neither knew much. Von Klein had largely been forgotten. In fact, they had initially been eager to talk to us because they believed we would shed some light on their family history. But they did know one thing: the manuscript had been destroyed. Things had gone mysteriously wrong for von Klein in his later life, and when on his deathbed, he still had not succeeded in publishing his magnum opus, he requested his wife burn it after he passed. We were discouraged by these conversations, but we couldn't believe something that he had spent the better part of 2 decades laboring over could simply be destroyed without a trace. The famous Bohemian novelist Franz Kafka, Professor Hartzog reminded us, wanted his unfinished manuscripts destroyed, but his executor shirked his duty. The wife of the brilliant Russian-American author Vladimir Nabokov likewise failed to follow her late husband's wishes, and one of his novels was thus published posthumously as well. Why not the same with our man, von Klein? A few months later, COVID hit, and still very new to IU, I could no longer recruit research participants from clinic, and my other projects ground to a halt. In their place, I filled my time trying to suss out where von Klein's manuscript might still be tucked away. We reached out to his would-be publisher, but that company had long since folded. Local historical societies and the archives of the American Medical Association likewise proved dead ends. We posted our question on the Caduceus History of Medicine listserv. Everyone there had heard of the Ebers Papyrus, of course, but no one knew anything about von Klein or his translation. So we did the next natural thing. We got subscriptions to Ancestry.com and newspapers.com, and after some combing, a picture began to emerge. While years hence, we still have no photo of Carl von Klein, we know a great deal about who he was and what he did. Born in Prussia and attending medical school in various prestigious institutions of Central Europe, he emigrated to Indiana in about 1871. There, he married the daughter of other Prussian immigrants. They began a family, and he hung up his shingle as a country doctor. While his wife remained in the Midwest raising their 5 children, he regularly returned to Europe to serve as a surgeon for the newly formed Red Cross in a number of military conflicts in the Balkans. While abroad, he learned of the unearthing of the Ebers Papyrus and, enthralled by the discovery, uprooted his family and moved them to Chicago, where he made a name for himself translating both ancient and recent medical texts in the well-resourced scientific libraries of that city. We had already figured out, both from our interviews with von Klein's descendants and reading his speech in JAMA, that his oldest daughter, Edith, had helped him with the translation of the papyrus, but it quickly became clear that she had not just helped, but had closely and vitally been involved. Von Klein seemed to have recognized her intellectual capacities early on and paid extra money to support her education, paying for her to attend a private school that provided secondary education for girls, and even sending her to the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Rome to study linguistics. When she returned to the States, she had developed, in von Klein's words, quote, the same interests and purpose as that of her father, namely to cultivate medical history and to elevate the standing of the humane and noble profession of medicine. And subsequently, she spent 7 years working with him on the translation of the Ebers Papyrus. However, in 1904, she fell for Franz Zittelmann, a German diplomat stationed in Chicago, and after a small but elegant wedding in the following year in their family's sumptuous 3-story brownstone in the Loop, a block off Oak Street Beach, she moved with her husband to Berlin. This severed her collaboration with von Klein. It also, and both Professor Hartzog and I were enthralled by this turn of fate, drew her into the world of international espionage, which I will discuss more later in this talk. So this seems like we might have found our answer to why von Klein's translation never saw the light of day. But as we scoured the internet archives for von Klein's obituaries, we found a common narrative emerging. Every newspaper from the LA Times to the New York Times reported in late 1913 that the real cause for von Klein's failure to publish his manuscript before his death, quote, nearly finished, proclaimed JAMA around the same time, was his wayward son. Edmund von Klein, 1 year Edith Jr., had made himself the villain of international news coverage after his unveiling as the, quote, man of mystery who had spent the preceding decade traveling the American countryside, seducing women in order to steal their diamonds. Von Klein, these reports claimed, had beggared himself attempting to keep his son out of prison all these years and ultimately died of a broken heart. Now there's a story, we said to ourselves, a German aristocrat turned country doctor turned amateur Egyptologist, aided by his brilliant linguist daughter, who ends up married to a Nazi spy, and broken by his notorious son, the philandering gem thief. Our downtime, spurred by the pandemic, quickly filled with historical sleuthing into the fascinating and elaborate history. So we really did a deep dive. Here, I'm going to show you just a smattering of some of the sources that we looked at. You can see naturalization documents, ship manifests, von Klein's death certificate, court records. We read literally everything that von Klein ever published in an academic press, and he was very prolific. And we turned to online newspaper archives, both newspaper.com and a number of other ones. We also took archival research trips twice to Chicago in correspondence with the Charité and Foreign Office in Berlin, the Red Cross of Russia, historians in Munich and Indianapolis, the Minneapolis and Portland court archives, translations of texts attempted by yours truly from Norwegian, Polish, French, and Italian. And we were very lucky to uncover some personal artifacts. Here you can see not just some things belonging to Carl. Also, we have correspondence between Carl's son-in-law, Franz, with some prominent Egyptologists at the University of Chicago, as well as we actually managed to get, you can see some essays and other writings of Edith von Klein from her middle and high school years. And we're also very lucky in other instances. Here you can see on, I guess, my right, your left, a very long text in German with a single footnote that references Dr. Carl von Klein, which may seem kind of incidental at first, but actually is one of our very few instances that we have actual clear proof of Carl's relationship with his relatives in Europe. And then you can also see a number of different spellings. Standardization was not the thing it is today. That helped us kind of coincidentally find more text related to Carl. And so we began writing. A short piece we published in the Journal of the Medical Library Association, the first and only time anyone has published on the von Klein manuscript, was not enough to do justice to all the fascinating, scandalizing, and sometimes mysterious stories we kept uncovering. Our next step, of course, was to write the book. We're currently 292 pages deep and plan to submit to a trade publisher for a popular audience later this summer. Nearly 5 years after I first heard the name Carl von Klein, Professor Hartsock and I have spent countless hours discussing this enigmatic family. But as ethicists, we have also spent countless hours debating how to write this history appropriately, how to balance a convincing and entertaining story with a faithful and sensitive representation of our historical subjects. It is these conversations that will be the focus of the remainder of my talk. So as we've seen already, there are three primary roles with ethical stakes in life writing: the author, the audience, and the subject of that writing. The author or the analyst collects the data and narratives, assembles and interprets them, and then represents them according to their particular goals and their particular arguments. Authors must have some right to tell a story true to their purpose and in the form they want, a poem, a melodrama, a farce, or they may not tell that story at all. The audience also makes certain demands on the life writing process. First and foremost, they must be able to understand the narrative. If the author fails to do this much, then the audience gains nothing, the author gains nothing. The audience also demands that the narratives be relevant and contextualized. While the stakes may seem lower here, the same ethics underpins this duty as the duty to inform your patients for their healthcare decision-making. If they don't know how to make use of the information you've provided them, they may use those data in inappropriate and potentially harmful ways. And of course, the audience has the right not to be fooled. This is not the same as to say they have the right to know the truth, in quotes, as it's conceived in scientific writing or clinical care. Life writing, even historical nonfiction like Professor Hartsock and my biographical project, is a distinct genre with its own epistemological conventions. But the audience has a right to know what those conventions are and to presume the audience is cleaving to them. As authors, we cannot simply state consensus historical fact and then jump to wild speculation without cluing our audience into this evidential shift first. Finally, and perhaps most critically, there are the ethical rights of the subjects of life writing. With patients, I consider how to retell their stories and how retelling them can either improve or hinder their self-advocacy and their own interests. Under certain circumstances, life writing subjects may also have rights to consent to their having their stories retold. This is the case with almost all of my other work. When I interview patients or rare disease advocates, for instance, I always first walk through an informed consent script and get their verbal or written agreement before proceeding, something you are all familiar with. For this project, though, all the individuals whose biographies we discuss have been dead for at least 6 decades, and some died more than a century ago. The IRB would say they are no longer human subjects protected by the usual research guidelines. Moreover, our biographical subjects were in some sense public figures, writers, diplomats, and infamous criminals who plastered their names across newspaper headlines from Manila to San Francisco to London, and everywhere in between. This would limit their expectation of privacy, even if they were still alive. Nonetheless, some duties clearly remain. These deceased persons' stories should be represented faithfully, neither villainizing nor superficially celebrating them. And while they seem not to have ethical claims to privacy in the usual sense anymore, we must also consider group harms of bad representation. Family and descendants do exist, though in our case, the last name von Klein seems largely to have gone extinct. In the remaining half of this talk, I want to examine these ethical issues of representation through a series of 3 cases from Professor Hartsock and my work, and our many reflective conversations about it. In so doing, I'll unpack the duties we may have in life writing to ourselves, our audiences, and our subjects. But I also argue that these considerations are not unique to this field of study. In fact, I'll suggest how they parallel and can even inform our relationship with our patients and medical research participants. I'll begin with an issue that Dr. Carl von Klein himself faced in translating the Ebers Papyrus that at first blush may seem straightforward. It is anything but. At the time of his work, so around the turn of the 20th century, there were many ancient Egyptian words for which English equivalents had not yet been determined. In fact, this is very much still the case. Many words are still having their definitions sussed out. One of these particularly problematic words is transliterated AAA, likely pronounced as an overlong ah. In considering its context and descriptions, scholars continue to debate what exactly it means. Some argue we translate it as schistosomiasis, a modern disease category, or as the parasites that serve as its vectors, or perhaps it referred to the symptoms of the disease rather than the disease entity itself. Or more radically, if ancient Egyptians conceived of it as a sort of spiritual rather than physical entity, would it be best to translate it as demon, even though today physicians would consider these medical cases described by the papyrus to be caused by blood flukes? Egyptologists, like all scholars working with dead languages, must constantly debate such translations. Something that seemed so straightforward when it was just Guten Tag means hello becomes much more complicated when the worldviews of the speakers are sufficiently divergent. And I have one kind of cutesy example of this from last week when I was visiting my niece, who's 2 years old. So when I was over, she has hundreds of words and she was talking nonstop. Some of them are clearly English, some of them less so clearly English. And in one of those utterances, she was looking in the direction of a toy on a shelf. And immediately both I and her parents exclaimed what we thought she was saying. I thought she was saying Sylvie, her name. One of her parents thought that she was saying Peppy, the name of her pepperoni pizza stuffy. And then the other parent said that that they thought that she was saying help me. as in help me get it down from the shelf. So this is one example of what the analytic philosopher Willard Klein calls the indeterminacy of translation. So even with sufficient or a significant amount of context, we still can't say definitively what the intention behind the utterance was. So Quine gives the example of gavagai. So in this example, a linguist is in the field with some of his informants, and they're out for a hunt, and one of them points in the direction of a rabbit and says gavagai. Maybe people are familiar with this example. It's a great one. So the linguist gets out his notebook and immediately writes down gavagai equals rabbit. But in fact, it's unclear based on the context what specifically the individual was referring to with gavagai. Did that hunter mean rabbit in the exact same sense that we mean it in English? Did he mean rabbit in a particular stage of life? Did he mean the meat that would eventually come from the rabbit? Did he mean let's go hunting? Or, and this is what I intend with the moon, did he mean something superstitious or supernatural, as in the rabbit is an omen of some other kind of an event? This is primarily, ancient Egyptian physicians used moldy bread. Oh, I have to go back. Ancient Egyptian physicians used moldy bread to treat battlefield wounds. What is gained or lost if we choose to translate a word as moldy bread versus penicillin, or swelling versus cancer? This is primarily a semantic issue, but it has a political and thus ethical dimension as well. Translating AAA as schistosomiasis suggests that ancient Egyptians knew about the disease, that they understood it in some salient way as the same as we do today. Translating it makes a claim about the production of knowledge, by whom and when something was known. By the same token, in rejecting the translation incubus or demon, the translator erases or ignores the potential spiritual or supernatural valence of the term. We can see this political dimension of translation even more clearly in our own work. As you'll recall, Karl von Klein spent several years abroad in the Balkans in the 1870s, serving with the International Red Cross. During this time, he sent letters home to Indiana, describing his adventures in what seemed to his neighbors to be a very foreign land. In fact, many of the towns in which he served did not have standard English names. It actually made it very challenging for us, Professor Hartsock and me, to trace his movements during his time abroad. He wrote, for instance, of his time in Satanova, and only after hours poring over centuries-old maps, were we able to determine this was what at the time was locally called Satano. Do I have that written there? Yes, okay. Von Klein seems to have had an idiosyncratic style of romanization. Satano today is known as Novosilska. So what do we call it in our book? Satanova, Satano, Novosilska? Each of these has implications for what we expect our readers to know and what context they need to interpret the story as we want them to. But these decisions can also be political. Historical Satano was owned by the Romanian crown, though today it falls within Ukrainian territory. Do we use von Klein's outdated spelling of Tsar with a CZ, or opt for a more accurate Russian TS? Do we talk about the viceroys of Egypt or the khedives? Again, we need to consider what our audience will understand, but in these types of cases, we must also consider the geopolitical implications, the stance certain spellings and names imply regarding imperialism and post-colonialism, etc. Similarly, similar to calling the city Mumbai versus Bombay, this can be seen as taking a stance vis-a-vis the British Raj, local Marathis, and Hindu nationalism. Peter Jackson, the historian, not the filmmaker, opens his recent book From Genghis Khan to Tamerlane by stating that, quote, the title page in this is the last occasion in this book where the two individuals will be called by their anglicized names. On the subsequent nearly 700 pages, he prefers to refer to them as they would have referred to themselves, as Chinggis Khan and Timur Ilang. Similarly, in our clinic notes, the same ethical issues are at stake. When we write that a patient is depressed or state a race or contested diagnosis or symptom, what is our evidential base? What contextualization or qualification must we provide for our audience? What are the political or practical stakes for our subjects when we choose what words with which to tell their stories? My next case is the word Germany. Here you can see a clipping from Karl von Klein's death certificate, where his wife listed his place of birth as Germany, even though Germany did not exist until Karl was nearly 30 years old. Yet many of his official documents, including all of his appearances on the US Census and even his own autobiographical statements, von Klein was said to have been born in, quote, Germany. When his contemporaries wrote about him, they called him a German rather than a Prussian. Something critical is lost in this nomenclatural laxity. And here you can see behind the death certificate a map of what Germany actually, what we call Germany now, actually looked like at the time of Karl's birth. Dozens, if not hundreds, of kingdoms, principalities, etc., many of which in 1871 unified. But certainly at the time, for him, it was Prussia. So something critical is lost in this nomenclatural laxity. Foremost of the issues arising from it is that we don't know where exactly von Klein was born. We know he was from a location called Marienwerder, but unfortunately there were 4 or 5 Marienwerders in the various German states at the time of his birth. Which one was it? None of these Marienwerder church records provide us any clues. Some were lost, some lost their archives during the wars, some don't keep records that far back, and others definitely have no records of any residents named von Klein. And yet German is how von Klein came to identify when he wasn't identifying as American or occasionally Russian. And German is certainly how his neighbors saw him. He was a member of the, quote, German delegation of the American Medical Association. He proposed opening a new German hospital, and newspapers called him, quote, a German scholar and a native of Germany and born of German parents. His experience was of a German, not of a Prussian. So should we call him a German or a Prussian immigrant? The term Germany gets even more politically dicey when we look at the experience of his daughter, Edith. She too was a professed member of the German cultural elite of Chicago, even though, like her father, she too was not born there. And through those circles, she eventually met and married the German vice consul. A few years later, her husband, Franz Zittelmann, was promoted to senior lieutenant and consul general, and the empire saw fit to transfer him and with his wife and 3-year-old daughter from Berlin to American-occupied Manila on the opposite side of the world. The Philippine Islands had recently been passed from Spain to the United States at the end of the Spanish-American War. Filipino resistance had been driven into the provinces by the time the Zittelmann family arrived, but resentment of the occupation continued. In the archipelago, Franz and Edith integrated themselves into German diplomatic and mercantile society, and through these connections, Franz, like many other diplomats of the Reich at that time, became involved in espionage bent on undermining the extractive imperial powers of the United States and Britain in their southern colonies. As his co-conspirators were attempting in British-owned India and Afghanistan, Franz secretly agitated for the local independence movement in the Philippine Islands. He organized the publication of pro-independence propaganda in the newspapers. He also bought and sold arms to would-be rebels. Shortly after the United States closed diplomatic channels with Germany during World War I, Franz's espionage was uncovered and he was accused of a conspiracy against the United States. Luckily for him, he had boarded a ship to Germany only a few weeks prior and thus could not be brought to trial. Franz's next appointment was as the Reichsminister to Cuba. He remained in Havana for a dozen years before he and Edith returned to Berlin to continue his service to the German state at exactly the same time that the Nazi Party was sweeping over parliament. We know that the Zittelmanns attended functions with the top brass of the National Socialists, and one of our interviewees even recounted a story of her grandmother meeting Adolf Hitler himself. And there's also the mysterious circumstances of Franz's supposed death. Franz was reported dead shortly after the end of the Nuremberg trials, the famous hearings against the Nazi doctors that gave rise in many ways to modern research ethics. But one report I found suggested that Franz simply, quote, disappeared rather than actually died, perhaps fleeing to South America with so many other officials of the Third Reich. I will mention here, I personally believe this conspiracy theory is wrong, but it is circulating. In recounting these stories and writing this history, we also have to consider what it means to say that these people were Germans. Do we say they worked for Germany, for the Reich, for the Nazi Party? Each term obviously has different valence, and each has a different impact on how our audience will view and sympathize with their characters' actions. Additionally, such broad labels paper over important features of their individual biographies and experiences. Edith and her daughters, for instance, were proudly Catholic and staunch in their convictions and practice, and they stayed in touch with their American relatives and regularly returned for visits. Each of these things surely would have drawn the ire of Nazi leaders. We don't know how they made sense of these conflicting identities. Likewise, Franz's motivations are impossible to know, but critical to our contemporary audience's assessment of his acts of espionage, subverting American imperialism in the Philippines, but to what end? He didn't seem to think very highly of the locals in communications with the imperial government in Berlin, but then he seemed pretty beloved on the ground. Was he promoting independence against an occupying force, or was he subverting, albeit problematic, American economic interests in favor of an evil Reich? In undertaking life writing, we must avoid both cheap shots and easy forgiveness. Now we turn to the last of our three cases, which I'm calling He Said, She Said. And again, the orthography here is very relevant if you care. Much of Professor Hartsock and my information, including most of our most intimate scenes, come from newspaper articles. We've always tried to triangulate and verify these reports with other sources, such as professional histories, other witness accounts, and government documents. But sometimes the vividness and detail of the articles are hard to certify and even harder to pass up in retelling the story. For instance, this is the scene of the arrest of Karl von Klein's son, Edmund, in the spring of 1913. Again, I won't read this for you, but I am going to provide some context. Edmund had presented himself as Jack Lewis, a quote, mining promoter and racetrack man, in order to seduce and marry the wealthy young Ethel Newcomb, who was vacationing in the Pacific Northwest. 3 days into their honeymoon, he disappeared with no intentions ever of seeing Ethel again. 2 years later, the newspaper set a dramatic scene as Ethel confronts her runaway husband in the Bacchanalian Pompeian room in Chicago, where he was surrounded by mobsters and the ultra-rich. They tell us the shape of her dress, the illicit smell of booze on the air, the very words she uttered, and how she pronounced them to make Edmund quake in her at her accusation. They also report that, under his breath, he threatened to kill her. Police reports confirm the scene of the arrest, its location, its date, its hour, but with none of the life. And nowhere is the death threat mentioned again. In fact, other reports from Ethel potentially contradict it. With some basic media literacy, we could easily suggest that the newspaper article is a fanciful retelling of these events. Whose fantasy, though? Was it Ethel's or the journalists? What influence on the narrative did Edmund's later charismatic interviews with the same journalists have? What would it mean for us to borrow quotes from these articles, with proper citations, of course, and place them in the mouths of our characters, just as the newspapers had done before us? After spending half a decade with these historical figures, it is hard not to impute emotions and motivations to their choices. And there's nothing wrong with an imaginative reconstruction in life writing, so long as your audience is cued into the evidential shift, something that yellow journalism, and I think increasingly journalism today too, is not particularly concerned with. What are the risks and benefits of including a smattering of salacious quips, what English professor and fellow Chicago alum David Richter calls, quote, retail instances of distortion and falsification? But in other ways, Professor Hartsock and I have tried to separate ourselves quite fully from the ethos of the newspaper narratives we've consulted. This critical problem with our sources, especially our journalistic sources, is the very different set of beliefs their authors held about the appropriate way to talk about vulnerable populations, to make marginalized people one's subjects. They were, as the saying goes, men of their time. I'll briefly discuss both the issues of representing mental illness and representing the plight of women then versus today. Edmund was troubled from his earliest youth. And here you can see a photo from an early mugshot. In fact, our first story of him after his birth was when he attempted to run away at the age of 12. The next year, his father, Carl, called the cops on him. At 15, he was arrested for theft, and a few months later, he escaped from the Midwest to New York City, where he lived off his wiles as a, quote, professional crook. His father eventually tracked him down, but not before his photo was hanging in the rogues gallery of NYPD headquarters. This series of petty larceny, identity theft, and delinquency crescendoed into his 20s. In fact, he wooed his first wife under the name Dr. Harry Kohler, a professional clairvoyant and heir to a sheep farming empire in Australia, supposedly. This couple remained married for 11 years before he eventually was arrested and unmasked as a con man. Throughout those years, we have reports of Edmund's emotional extremes, riding high on the top of his wild pseudonyms and collapsing in desultory after his rages. Upon his arrest, he reportedly attempted suicide. Contemporary newspapers chuckled and belittled this act. It wasn't the only time either. And then when he collapsed after his father's death, Edmund could not go to see him as he was in jail in Oregon. Journalist Riley reported his, quote, hysteria. It seems likely, looking at this case history, that he may have suffered from some mental health challenges, possibly suggesting reduced culpability, or at least a bit more empathy than we would typically give for a criminal of his caliber. We've spoken about this history with several friends in relevant professions to vet our thoughts, but of course, ultimately, he did not have a diagnosis, at least one that was public. So we can't say anything to that regard, but that does not mean that we should retell his story of mental and emotional tumult with the same glee as did contemporary newspapers. But we also must balance any charity we pay to Edmund with the respect for the women whose lives he upended, whose own mental health he devastated. His first wife, for instance, never remarried, shunning the company of men. His accuser, Ethel Newcomb, faced death threats and lurid interest from a public audience of strangers brought on by Edmund's trials, and ultimately chose to commit the misdemeanor of absconding as a witness in his final trial and changing her identity rather than face further public scrutiny, thus never getting to see justice finally, though only ultimately briefly, served against her erstwhile husband. During his trials, many other women came forward from across the United States, identifying Edmund as their own would-be husbands and con men. Articles call them easy marks, simple-minded, commented on their looks and their age. Poignantly, the same day that a Chicago newspaper announced that the prisoner calling himself Jack Lewis was indeed Edmund von Klein, son of the famous Egyptologist, it was also reported on that same page that JAMA, quote, suggests asylums for suffragettes and that, quote, these fanatics should be handled by insanity experts. In making use of these sources, how do we safeguard against the influx of such noxious views, views we now hold as immoral, but were at the time fairly accepted and current? There is, of course, something compelling about such yellow journalism and its gossip column style. Some schadenfreude in hearing how Edmund became hysterical after his guilty verdict, and some sense of being there in learning how each of these women supposedly dressed and carried themselves and with what accents they spoke. But how far can we trust these sources to have been honest, and how far can we trust them to have been good? We all bring a specific perspective with all its limitations and biases to everything we interpret and analyze, to everything we write. This is the tyranny of the author. Like the clinician consenting the patient, we are the ones in the position of expertise with all the relevant information, and we therefore have to determine what information we choose to provide to our audience. We have to consider how our biases impact the narratives we tell and how we tell them. Methodologically, Professor Hartsock and I have encountered numerous ethical challenges in the production of this biography. In large part, these have been due to what social scientists call agnotological forces, cultural and structural forces that work not to produce knowledge, but to destroy it. Both Edith's departure and Edmund's criminal behavior had agnotological effects, leading to the loss of the first English translation of the Ebers Papyrus and ultimately delaying the publication of such a work by nearly 3 decades. But we have also encountered many small gaps in the existent archives as well. Which Marienwerder was von Klein's birthplace? What really happened to Franz in 1947? What became of Ethel Newcomb after Edmund's sentencing? And these are compounded by our at times unreliable sources: Carl's boasting, Edmund's prevarication, townspeople's rumors, yellow journalists' rapacity. These inconsistencies disrupt a single coherent narrative and the omniscience to which we as authors aspire to lay claim. We are thus left with the problem of what to do in our narrative with all the gaps provided by the historical record. Do we retouch the past and end up with something that may or may not resemble what actually but unknowably happened, like the Jesus portrait here? Or do we stick with what with only the best historical evidence of our story even if that means we end up with a text that fails to resonate as thoroughly with our audience as with the statue of Augustus on the right or your left, or right. Let's see. Even if it means that we end up with a text that fails to resonate as thoroughly with our audience, fails to capture the being there of the events that must have transpired. As with all the best ethics questions, there isn't necessarily one right answer. The goal is instead to recognize which questions to ask and how to balance the competing and conflicting values and interests in each particular case. Now let's turn to the big question of representation. There are, in fact, two distinct senses of representation glossed over by the single English word. The Germans, of course, have two, or we have one. The first meaning of representation is the creation of an artistic portrait, a descriptive and aesthetic work in which some aspect of the world, some narrative, is represented for an audience to consume. The second meaning is a type of surrogacy, where the author or analyst gives voice and advocacy to their subjects' experiences and interests. In all life writing, about patients as much as about historical figures, we must consider our duties to both forms of representation, whether we're considering the political implications of which name to select for an ancient Egyptian diagnosis or a town in Romania, whether we say Karl was a Prussian or Franz was a German diplomat, or whether we take a journalist or even a primary source at their word. Each of these decisions impacts both the literary work and our audience's relationship to our subjects. All three parties have ethical and political interests in the choices of representation that must be identified, weighed, and decided. While I don't have time to unpack all the implications, I hope it's apparent to everyone in my own audience that these issues apply not just to our historical, but also our contemporary subjects, whose life stories we narrate each day in our clinic notes, research reports, and drive-by consults. And I do have some references if you're interested. Each of these, I think, are fantastic and provide very different perspectives on these issues of representation. I think that'll probably be available online. And thank you very much for your attention. You can email either myself or Professor Hartzog if you're interested in seeing when the book comes out. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any and all questions.
Thank you, Colin, for helping us walk through how you think about writing. And it's a different perspective than what we've have before. We usually get the written piece, not the thinking about how you write. Thank you. There's a piece that I think I'm missing, and I'm sure you said it, and I just missed it, and so I apologize. How, if his manuscript was destroyed, how do we know it ever existed?
That's a great question. You're not the first person to ask either. So we know it exists because we have quotes from it in various publications from other people at the time. We also have descriptions of his writing process that he published, but the manuscript itself seems like it doesn't exist. We're not holding our breath. It seems like it's gone.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Colin. If there are no other questions, no? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wait, sorry, one just came at the last second. Do you think we still have issues of lost in translation with common disease? And the one I am thinking of is COVID, which seems to be used very differently in various ways.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great question. There is, yeah, I mean, this is something that I wonder about too, especially with, I've done some work on the other side of my life with reclassification of diseases and reclassification of genetic variants, and thinking through how the scientific discourse may leave a population behind, but the population still exists, and they may still identify socially, or may even understand themselves to be a part of a disease community that scientific medicine no longer recognizes. So yes, I think that's really interesting, and it gets at the kind of point of what the word is supposed to do more than what it's supposed to mean. because for those groups of patients, it's still doing a lot. And so the question of how it's being used seems in some cases more useful than how people want it to be used.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye.